about them, but I can't get away from them. They're everywhere, in my face.
Look, Kyle, we just kind of don't care about some dumb prince and his stupid...
Trying to make ourselves into a brand just turned us into products. We don't need to be a brand, do we?
It's so funny, too, that you keep calling me Megan. You know, it's Megan now.
God damn it, now the prince is playing polo on the lawn.
We are here because privacy is a basic human right. How many more princes and his wives have to live in this nightmare?
This woman looks to me like a malignant narcissist. This woman has zero self-awareness.
I love that your eyes are sparkling right now. You know, Megan, how are you today? Which, by the way, I just have to say, yes.
Enjoy them.
I forgot to have fun. You're right. You're right.
That 2-hour podcast that I just had to sit through with Jamie Keen Lima, who is also very cut off from the rest of the world.
Down with the motorhead. We deserve our prize.
Nobody saw the punchline coming because Meghan Markle's Paris Fashion Week appearance was supposed to scream comeback, glamour, relevance, and a carefully engineered return to the center of celebrity culture. But somehow, the louder the cameras became, the colder the reaction seemed to get. And that is where this story takes a very different turn. What was supposed to look like a triumphant fashion moment began attracting a completely different kind of attention. Because instead of the roaring response expected from a major celebrity comeback, the atmosphere felt strangely quiet, almost painfully quiet. And then came the twist that changed the entire conversation. South Park turned that very image into comedy. Suddenly, the polished Paris appearance wasn't being discussed simply as fashion. It was being viewed as material for satire. And that is where the real embarrassment began. The cameras were ready. The fashion crowd was watching. The image machine was clearly prepared for a major moment. But when the expected explosion of excitement failed to arrive, the silence became its own story. Because in celebrity culture, attention is everything. Applause is valuable. Headlines are valuable. Even criticism can be valuable because criticism proves people are still watching. But indifference, that can be devastating. And suddenly the question wasn't whether Meghan Markle could attract cameras. Of course she could. The question was what those cameras were actually capturing. Was this really a comeback, or was it an elaborate attempt to manufacture the appearance of one? That distinction became increasingly uncomfortable once South Park entered the picture. South Park didn't simply throw another celebrity joke into the internet. The parody took the polished ingredients surrounding Meghan Markle's public image and exaggerated them until the contradictions became impossible to miss. Glamour, empowerment, victimhood, carefully controlled celebrity presentation. Everything was pushed through the sharpest possible satirical lens. And that is why the joke landed differently. It wasn't merely an insult. It functioned like a distorted mirror. The parody suggested that underneath the carefully constructed image was a public persona critics believed had become increasingly complicated, increasingly managed, and increasingly difficult to separate from the machinery of publicity. And then came the moment that made the entire thing even more uncomfortable. The joke connected the glamorous celebrity world with something much more ridiculous. Suddenly, the fashion appearance could be viewed not as an untouchable royal adjacent spectacle, but as a scene that could be laughed at. That shift matters, because once audiences stop treating an image with reverence and start treating it as comedy, the power of that image can change overnight. That parody was especially brutal because it didn't need to invent a completely separate character. It took recognizable elements associated with Meghan Markle's public story and pushed them into absurd territory. The joke was essentially saying, this is how the public image looks when the polished packaging is removed. The exaggerated labels, the celebrity connections, the royal status, the carefully presented identity, all of it became ammunition. And suddenly, every wave, every smile, every carefully positioned appearance could be interpreted through a completely different lens. That is the dangerous part of satire. It doesn't have to prove a conspiracy. It doesn't have to establish a secret plot. Sometimes it only needs to exaggerate something audiences already suspect. And when viewers recognize the exaggeration, they laugh because the underlying contradiction feels familiar. That was the uncomfortable territory South Park entered. The parody wasn't really attacking fame itself. It was attacking the idea of a perfectly controlled public persona. The image of authenticity publicity became the target. Critics had already argued that Meghan Markle's presentation could sometimes feel highly managed, highly polished, and carefully adapted for different audiences. South Park simply took that criticism and stretched it until it became ridiculous. And that is why the Paris Fashion Week moment suddenly looked different. A carefully staged appearance can create headlines, but satire can destroy the intended meaning of those headlines in seconds. Instead of asking whether the comeback was successful, people could suddenly ask whether the comeback had become the joke. The deeper issue was never simply fashion, it was perception. If a celebrity spends years building a carefully controlled identity, what happens when audiences begin looking past the presentation? What happens when every new appearance is judged against the last one? And what happens when a comedian can take all those contradictions, compress them into a few minutes, and make millions of people laugh? That is where the story becomes much bigger than one Paris appearance. Because South Park didn't have to destroy the image. It only had to make people question it. And once that question enters the audience's mind, it becomes very difficult to remove. The real mystery then isn't whether the parody was cruel. It clearly was. The real mystery is why it felt so effective. Was it because South Park created a new narrative around Meghan Markle, or because it found an existing one that was already waiting underneath the surface? And if the Paris comeback was supposed to restore the spotlight, why did the spotlight suddenly feel so much more dangerous? That is the question hanging over the entire episode. And the answer may be even more uncomfortable than the joke itself. But the story did not stop with the parody itself, because the real fallout began when the joke escaped the screen and entered the wider conversation. The central contradiction became impossible to ignore. Privacy was repeatedly presented as an important boundary, yet massive public platforms remained part of the story. Interviews, documentaries, appearances, carefully timed statements, lifestyle projects, and major celebrity events all kept the spotlight firmly in place. That does not automatically mean the desire for privacy was dishonest, but it created a tension that critics seized upon. South Park understood that tension immediately and transformed it into a punchline. The joke worked because it exaggerated the idea of someone insisting they wanted normality while remaining surrounded by cameras, publicity, and enormous public attention. Suddenly, privacy itself could be interpreted as part of the brand, another carefully presented element designed to create emotion and maintain relevance. That was where the satire became particularly uncomfortable. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry had built much of their public narrative around stepping away from royal life, demanding greater control, and seeking independence from relentless scrutiny. Yet the more publicly they explained their experiences, the more audiences were invited to examine those experiences. The contradiction became the story. You can publicly discuss wanting privacy, but once the story becomes a commercial product, a television event, an interview, or a major media moment, audiences naturally begin asking where personal life ends and public branding begins. South Park took that question and pushed it into absurd territory. It didn't need to invent an entirely new controversy. It simply exaggerated the existing tension until the message became impossible to miss. And then came the larger consequence. Before the parody became such a widely discussed cultural moment, criticism of Meghan Markle could feel much more carefully guarded in certain entertainment circles. Hollywood could remain polite, executives could remain cautious. Producers could look at the enormous attention surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and see opportunity. But satire changes the atmosphere because it gives audiences permission to laugh at something they may previously have treated with caution. Once a powerful public image becomes a joke, the social rules surrounding criticism can shift rapidly. Suddenly, memes become acceptable. Reaction videos multiply, commentators become more direct, and descriptions that once sounded too harsh begin appearing everywhere. That did not necessarily mean one episode destroyed a career. The more interesting development was subtler. The conversation began moving from sympathy towards scrutiny. Instead of simply accepting the public narrative, viewers began comparing different versions of the image. Humanitarian one week, business personality the next, fashion figure after that, and then another carefully presented reinvention. Every transformation created another question. Which version was the real one? And that question is devastating for any carefully constructed celebrity brand because branding depends on consistency. If audiences feel they are constantly being introduced to a new identity, they may eventually stop trying to understand the identity at all. Then the Balenciaga setting added another layer of irony. The fashion world itself is built around image, reputation, reinvention, and perception. Balenciaga had already experienced its own public reputation problems, making the appearance feel almost symbolically loaded. Here was a fashion brand dealing with questions about its image, while a celebrity surrounded by years of public debate appeared in one of the industry's most visible settings. ratings. The comparison was almost irresistible for Satire. Two carefully managed reputations, two efforts to move beyond controversy, two powerful image machines attempting to control what audiences saw next. And when the parody spread, reports and online discussion about possible legal complaints, accusations of cruelty, or claims of sexism only added fuel to the fire. That is the trap of fighting viral satire. Every objection can become another headline. Every complaint can send another curious viewer searching for the original joke. The harder anyone tries to control a joke after it becomes viral, the more unpredictable the conversation can become. A parody becomes a clip, the clip becomes a meme, the meme becomes commentary, and suddenly the original subject has almost no control over where the story travels. That is why the most damaging part may not have been the joke itself. It may have been the change in perspective. South Park did not necessarily destroy Meghan Markle's career. Instead, it encouraged audiences to examine the distance between the public image and the reality they believed they were seeing. Once viewers begin looking for contradictions, every future appearance can be judged through that new lens. Every outfit becomes a statement. Every interview becomes evidence. Every carefully timed comeback becomes another test. And that brings the story back to the Paris Fashion Week appearance. What was supposed to be a grand return to the spotlight became tangled with a completely different conversation about relevance, image, attention, and authenticity. The uncomfortable possibility was not that the parody created every criticism surrounding Meghan Markle. It was that the criticism was already there, waiting for someone to turn it into something instantly recognizable and shareable. So did South Park go too far? Or did it simply say, through exaggeration and comedy, what critics had already been saying for years? Maybe the real punchline is neither answer. Maybe the real punchline is that once an audience starts questioning the performance becomes much harder to control. The cameras can still appear, the headlines can still be written, the comeback can still be announced, but the audience has changed. And when people begin watching not to admire the image, but to search for what might be hiding behind it, the most carefully designed comeback can suddenly become the beginning of an entirely different story.